So thank you very much, Mohammed and Rudolph and Mr. Jules as well for setting up this very important training that we're going to be learning about today, that is taxing the digital economy. My name is Lyla Latif and I am a Kenyan-based lawyer specialized in international taxation and technology governance. I'm also the co-founder of the Committee on Fiscal Studies and the House of Fiscal Wisdom in Nairobi, where my team and we work on critical and contemporary fiscal issues and how they intersect with our society, our economy, trade relations, digitalization, and the investment sector. And I'm also an academic at the University of Nairobi, where I focus on advancing scholarship around public money, fighting against illicit financial flows, and regulating the taxation of digital business models. So I hope with this brief background, you are now comfortable knowing that you're in very good hands today, and I'm absolutely pleased to have you all join me in this training. So Mohammed, that was it in terms of introduction. Must have flashed. Thank you so much. So, as Mohammed has said, we'll have about 80 minutes together. And by the end, this is what I'm hoping that you will go home with. First, you will understand how the digital economy actually generates revenue. Second, you're going to have an understanding about why our current tax system cannot see most of this revenue that we generate from the digital economy. We're also going to be looking at what global frameworks exist, including one that is genuinely transformative for Africa. And then we're also going to be discussing what WATAF and West Africa should be doing about it right now. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a training, it's not a lecture. So do keep live, posting in the chat your comments, any questions you have, and even examples that come to mind. So, Francis, if you may move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So before we go any further, I want to start by presenting you with a hypothetical scenario, and I want us to really reflect on it, because this is what truly the digital economy is about, and this is where the problem comes in for tax administrators who want to try and establish how to determine whether a digital business model is subject to taxation or not. So I have this hypothetical scenario, and I'm going to talk to you about some facts about it, ask some questions, keep them in mind, because by the end of the training, you will already have answers to this. So now I want you to imagine that you have just walked into your office on Monday morning, and your commissioner hands you a file and says, we need a transfer pricing assessment on this one, right? The minister is asking questions. So you open the file, and here is what you find. A multinational digital platform, let's call it Stream Africa. It is incorporated in Mauritius, right? It earns subscription revenue from 4 million users across West Africa. $120 million a year. That's the amount it's making. Now, the content of Stream Africa is licensed from the parent company, which is called Stream Africa, and it is incorporated in Delaware in the United States. Okay? So the license agreement says the Mauritius entity pays a royalty of 85% of revenue to the US company for intellectual property. The local entity, which is in Nigeria, and we are calling it, say, Stream Africa Nigeria Limited, is a commission agent, and it earns 3% service fee. Now, the declared profit in Nigeria on $120 million of revenue, what is it? It's basically $800,000. Meanwhile, the parent company in Delaware, it's reporting global revenue of $9.2 billion and a profit margin of 28%. So, your commissioner wants you to assess the transfer pricing method for this particular company to determine if you can collect tax from it in your local entity. So now, is the arm's length principle satisfied? This is the digital economy. And this is the facts that have been brought about by this company that is in US, but it's also functioning in Nigeria, but it's a digital company. Now, how do we even begin to make a transfer pricing assessment? Think about it. What transfer pricing method applies here? Shall we say it's the CUP method, the comparable uncontrolled price? And if so, where do we find a comparable for a streaming platform licensing deal? There is no public database of what an arm's length royalty rate looks like for algorithmically curated content which is delivered to West African subscribers. So, or do you use the transactional net margin method or the profit split method, and then on what basis? And ladies and gentlemen, here is where it gets really interesting. You have 4 million West African users who are generating data every time they watch something, they rate something, they search for something. And that data trains the algorithm. The algorithm improves the service. The improved service attracts more users. This is all about network effects, right? Which is a concept our transfer pricing guidelines do not mention. It's not in the UN model of tax convention, and it's not in the OECD model. Okay, so does that user generated value count in the functional analysis when you want to determine arm's length pricing? So under the current OECD guidelines, the answer is essentially no. Users are not recognized as contributing to value creation. So the local entity that's in Nigeria for Stream Africa, we said that it earns 3%. 3% of $120 million for managing a market of 4 million subscribers. Is that arm's length for a market this size? And then compared to what? What is your comparable? And if no comparable exists, right? If the business model is so new that there is nothing to compare it to, what do we do? What do we do in our countries? What do you do in the West Africa region? Because that is not hypothetical. This is the reality digital firms create every day. And it is the reality our existing tools are not built to capture. So I want you to keep this scenario in your mind, okay? We're going to come back to it throughout the session today. Every concept that I'm going to introduce today, be it permanent establishment, characterization, the invisible economy. You'll hear me talk about Pillar 1, Article 12B. I want you to reflect and test it against Stream Africa, this hypothetical scenario I've given you. Ask yourself, does this framework solve the problem on my desk? Because that is the only question that matters for a tax administrator. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Now, what are we actually talking about when we say the digital economy? And this is really interesting, okay? And I want to be precise because precision matters when we are trying to design policy and when we are assessing a transfer pricing file like the one I just talked to you about, Stream Africa. Now, at the heart of every digital business, every single one, you will find the same engine, data and algorithms. And then think about it in the sense of Google. Google has a search algorithm. Facebook has a news feed. Netflix has recommendation engine. And then Uber has its own pricing model. When you switch on the Uber app, you see different cars giving a different price. Now, when we talk about the hypothetical scenario of Stream Africa's content curation, that's also an example that features within data and algorithm. Now, when you strip away the branding and the user interfaces, and what you find in the digital economy is just data flowing in and data flowing out. That is the core. And built around that core are 4 features that makes the digital economy fundamentally different from what came before. Right? So we have this concept of dematerialization. And this simply means value creation no longer requires physical goods in a physical place. And then we have network effects, right here. which means the more users a platform attracts, the more valuable it becomes, which creates a winner take all dynamics where one platform dominates an entire market. And then we have something called scale without mass. It's a feature of the digital economy. This simply means a company can serve 1 billion users with a few thousand employees and a fleet of servers. Okay? And then we finally, as one of the features of the digital economy, we have what we call multi-sided platforms. These are simply businesses that create value by connecting two or more groups, like for example of buyers and sellers, riders and drivers, advertisers and audiences as well. Now, what is important here is on the bottom of the slide, the rules that govern all of this digital economy. So we have the rules of permanent establishment and nexus rules from the OECD and the UN Model Conventions. We have transfer pricing that is governed by the arm's length principle. So we have over 2,500 bilateral tax treaties. And there is also the World Trade Organization's moratorium on customs duties for electronic transmissions. Now, all these rules were designed in the 1920s and the 1930s, when the League of Nations, which is today called the United Nations, was establishing the foundational principles of international tax allocation. And African countries, we were colonies at that time. We had no input into the architecture that now governs our taxing rights. Now, this is not a conspiracy theory, this is a historical fact. And it matters because the architecture that carries the imprint of its origins, right? Everything was about physical offices, physical factories, people being in a particular jurisdiction that subjected a country to be able to tax that company. But now we have Google, we have OpenAI, and these companies are virtual, but they're extracting revenue from 194 countries all around the world. Can all these 194 countries tax the global revenue that is generated by Google, by OpenAI, by NVIDIA, for example? Now, the thing is, we don't have the rules because the rules are historical. The rules are 1920 rules that are built on the concept of permanent establishment. That's the problem. But then we also have gray areas, right? And these are areas where the law exists but has no idea what to do. How do you value the data that African users contribute to platforms? So every time we use the Google platform, for every minute we are on Google, Google earns about $12 from our interaction on the Google search platform. Now, how do we establish how much Google has earned from Senegal? How much it has earned from Burkina Faso or from Nigeria? How do we determine that? And then how do we say to Google, based on the information that we've collected, that our Nigerian population contributed to 20 million US dollars towards your profit, so allow us to tax X%. How do we determine that? There is no agreed methodology. So for example, when you have a Kenyan business that pays for Microsoft, are we making payment for royalty, a service fee, or a business profit? And as a lawyer, we keep fighting about this for years. And while we are fighting, no tax is being collected, okay? And then beyond the gray areas, there are also areas that are entirely outside the law. You're hearing new concepts called decentralized finance, DeFi, right? You're hearing words like artificial intelligence as a service, algorithmic pricing, data brokerage. These are real economic activities generating real revenue in a complete regulatory vacuum. There is no law to agree on how we're supposed to tax these emerging business models. Next slide, please. So, next slide, please. So what is really important is, like, once we understand the features of the digital economy, the problems around it that prevent us from taxing it, we have to ask ourselves the question, where is the money? How is the money being generated as part of this digital framework? So let me tell you a story about where the money goes, because once you see it, then you can't unsee it, okay? So let's focus on the 5 companies. The major ones, right? Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and Meta. total, right? Together, these five companies, they earn roughly about $1.6 trillion in combined revenue, and that was their combined revenue in 2023. I mean, the figure is larger than the GDP of many African countries, and that is just the top tier. Below these five companies, there are hundreds of digital firms that are earning billions from African markets. How do they earn this money? So Google derives over 70% of its revenue from advertising. It's collecting data about us. It's building a behavioral profile, and it's selling targeted access to our eyeballs, right? And then cloud computing, it's also a $600 billion global market. We've got marketplace commissions through Uber, Jumia, Glovo. They take about 15 to 30% of every transaction. And then these companies are also making money through subscription, so Netflix, Spotify, Adobe, for example, they're making money through data sales. So when they build our user profile, they aggregate that, our profiles, like maybe if we're 50 million Kenyans, they would have built a profile of, say, about 20 million Kenyans. They aggregate that and then they sell it to the highest bidder. That's how they earn their money. So if they're earning money, where are their profits ending up? And are their profits being taxed? So the profits usually end up in Ireland, because Ireland is where these companies hold their intellectual property. Their profits also end up in the Netherlands, because the Netherlands is where they route most of their royalties. And then in Singapore, where they have their patent boxes, right? In Luxembourg, where they park now their profits. As you can see, none of the countries is Africa where they bring their profits and they keep them on the continent, right? It's always these tax havens or these secrecy jurisdictions. They also have it in the Cayman Islands, where basically there is 0% corporate tax rate. And these structures have names. You're going to hear a lot about double Irish, the Dutch sandwich. These are not secret. They are perfectly legal rules that have been created under the current OECD rules, which allows for illicit financial flows, which allows for tax avoidance and evasion within the way in which profits are made in digital business models. Meanwhile, in Africa, we have $180 billion in digital economic activity. 1.1 trillion in mobile transactions, 416 million mobile internet users. The consumption is on the continent, the users are on the continent, but the revenue is not on the continent, so we are not taxing the digital economy. Next slide, please. So in the next slide, I want to present the numbers, okay? Africa's average tax to GDP ratio is about 16 to 1%, and the average OECD is 33.9%, more than the double. And that gap is the difference between schools being built and schools not being built, right? The annual SDG financing gap is $1.3 trillion. And what sub-Saharan Africa paid in debt service in 2023 is $72 billion US. So in 13 African countries, debt service exceeds combined health and education spending. But every dollar of the digital revenue that escapes taxation, it deepens our dependency on debt. And when multinational enterprises earn from our market, but they book profits in Dublin or Singapore, then we lose the most fundamental expression of sovereign authority, which is the right to tax. So this is what I really wanted to touch on as I began the most important discussion about what's the digital economy, where is the money missing, why are we not capturing the profits for taxation, just to present an overview about it. But now, in the next slide, I want to get on to the critical aspects of the digital economy, which is looking at the digital business models. Next slide, please. We have to understand what these digital business models are, because we cannot tax what we don't understand. And think about the start when I talked to you about the Stream Africa scenario. You can't assess a transfer pricing method if you don't understand how the business actually makes money. So let's just fix that. What different types of digital business models are out there, and how do they make money? So the most common digital business model is e-commerce. This is Jumia, Amazon, Konga, right? The platform owns nothing, but it connects buyers and sellers, and it takes a commission. Typically that would be about 10 to 20% because it owns nothing and it ships nothing. It can structure itself to have no taxable presence in the buyer's country. We then have online advertising as a business model. Okay, this is where serious money is. When you use Google, you are not Google's customer, you are Google's product. Google collects data about your behavior and sells targeted access to advertisers. So the country where those users live basically receives nothing. The other digital business model that we should be aware of is what we call cloud computing, because this cloud computing is what catches most tax administrators off guard. African businesses are increasingly dependent on AWS, that's the Amazon Web Services, Azure, Google Cloud. We pay a monthly subscription for computing power on servers that are located in Virginia, the US. So is that payment a royalty, a service fee, a business profit, right? Under most existing treaties, nobody in Africa taxes it. Then the other digital business model is digital payments. Like in Kenya, we have M-Pesa. In Nigeria, we had the Flutterwave. There's OPay, there's Wave. There are a lot of transaction fees that these digital payments, get. There are foreign exchange margins. There's a lot of float income around it. And Africa, we lead here globally. But the challenge is that global players like Stripe, PayPal, they're also entering this market, and therefore the cross-border complications are continuing to multiply. Then the other type of a model is streaming. And here you can think about Netflix, Spotify, Showmax, yeah? Millions of subscribers are in Africa, but the profits from streaming digital business models are booked in the US or in the Netherlands. And then we also have the gig economy. The driver is in Lagos. The rider is in Lagos. The road is in Lagos. The petrol is bought in Lagos. But the Uber's taxable profit is not in Lagos. And why is that? Because there are no rules to help tax the digital economy. So next slide, please. So now you see everything that I have just described is the digital economy of today. But then we also have to think about what is coming in 2020, 2027, in 2035, in 2050, right? What will the digital economy be looking like, and are our rules, are our tax administrators ready to be able to identify how money is being made in these new models of emerging digital economy, and how do we tax them? Okay. Artificial intelligence as a service is a new concept. It's coming up. OpenAI, Google's Gemini, Anthropic. These are businesses across Africa. A lot of businesses across Africa, are now paying to access artificial intelligence through APIs, per token, per request. Yet there's no office in our country. There's no employee, no server in our country. Just a software, right? An API call that crosses the border at the speed of light, and most African digital service tax definitions do not even mention artificial intelligence. You tell me, look at your Income Tax Act, or even the rules that you have in your country. Is there any way that says we are going to apply a tax on artificial intelligence? That word, AI tax, is it there? And then cryptocurrency and decentralized finance is another emerging model in the space of the digital economy. And we have to know how this cryptocurrency and decentralized finance operates, because we will then be able to see how money is being made and where that money is moving, so that we can say, if this money was made from Kenya, then Kenya should be able to tax it. Okay? The problem is that the entire architecture of DeFi is designed to eliminate intermediaries. So we have no bank, we have no clearinghouse, there is no entity you can serve a tax assessment on. You simply cannot see where the money is coming and going, how it's moving. It's very invisible. And you have a lot of young people. Nigeria and Kenya is top, right? Where they are trading in crypto. They're earning real income, and none of it is being taxed. Not because they're evading, but because there is no framework. However, I think in Nigeria, there is the capital gains tax. So if you are trading in Bitcoin and if it appreciates at the point at which you want to sell that Bitcoin, you have to apply a capital gains tax. Similar model is not available in Kenya, but we have something we call the significant economic presence tax, that if we establish that that company has some sort of a residential connection with the Kenyan users, we would be able to tax that particular income that is coming in because of the trading in cryptos. And then there's this concept of data brokerage. It's a new type of a digital business model, and honestly, it really troubles me. Yeah, companies are harvesting data about African consumers, our purchasing habits, our search for, public health sector or symptoms that we have, our financial behavior, and then they're packaging it into profiles and they're selling those profiles on the global market. The people whose data it is have no idea. So a lot of my data could be sitting in the UK and it is being sold to a company in Singapore and I have no idea. And the countries where we live, like I live in Kenya and my data has been sold to Singapore company has made some money on it, but my country cannot tax the profit that the Singapore company has made on the basis of my data. This is a new type of colonial extraction because I don't know what else to call it. And then there's also something more. We're having a new digital business model in the form of tokenized assets. When you think about EdTech, technology is so that we don't have to send our children to school. They can study while they're on the computer, right? It's displacing public services. We have digital fright. We have gaming economies where young Africans spend real money on virtual goods. We also have the creator economy, TikTok, like a lot of influencers. They are earning cross-border income outside any formal structure. So this constellation of digital business models is expanding faster than our legal and administrative capacity to track it. And this is why I'm spending some time trying to explain to you what these digital business models look like, because once we understand it, only then can we talk about the development of rules to be able to tax this part of the digital economy. Next slide, please. So now this here is the slide that should keep every revenue authority in this room awake at night. Revenue is being generated from your citizens in your country right now, and your tax system cannot see it. So every time a Benin user sees a Google ad, Google earns money millions of times a day. Now, can the Benin tax administration see these transactions? I don't think so. When a Ghanaian business pays Amazon $10,000 a month for cloud hosting, can the Ghana Revenue Authority detect that payment? Now, in most cases, no. Okay? African user data is being harvested and sold by data brokers. Can any African tax authority see those sales? Facebook collects a lot of our data. Does Facebook report to your country to say that we have the profiles of 13 million Cabo Verdeans and we're selling that data to China, for example? You don't get this information at all. And when you look at large language models like ChatGPT, they're all trained on African language data. But what is the compensation to Africa? Nothing. But that's the question. All of this is invisible. And it's invisible because of 5 reasons that you're seeing there. Knowledge gap. Our officers have been trained on manufacturing era rules. Nobody taught them about APIs or algorithmic revenue. 2, infrastructure gap. There's no real-time transaction monitoring. 3, systems gap. We've got this legacy IT that is built for import duties. They cannot handle digital flows. Then we have the legal gap, which is the most problematic part of the problem. We have laws that are built around permanent establishment that digital firms deliberately avoid. And then we have the intelligence gap. There is no access to country-by-country reports. There is no automatic exchange. There is no audit trail for resident firms. So we can draft the most elegant digital service tax legislation in the world, and we did that for Kenya, and then we abandoned it. But if we cannot identify the taxpayer, if we cannot quantify the liability and collect the revenue, then the legislation that we have is just paper. So capacity becomes the binding constraint, and that is why we have this particular course for ourselves. Next slide, please. It's really hard to tax the digital economy. And I think the best way to be able to explain it is through this particular picture, right? Why is it hard to tax the digital economy? And at this point, I'd invite you to just type in the chat your quick knee-jerk reactions to why do you think it is really difficult to tax the digital economy. Look at this particular picture and you'll be able to get some ideas around it. And in my take, there are 6 challenges. The first one is permanent establishment. And if you know, when it comes to cross-border taxation, any company that is a foreign company, for it to be taxed in your country, it must establish a physical establishment, either in the form of an office, a factory, etc., right? There's Article 5 of the OECD and the UN tax models that explain to us this concept of permanent establishment. But digital corporations do not have a fixed place of business, and therefore permanent establishment rules don't apply. If PE doesn't apply, you can't tax. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a significant structural obstacle. Now, as you're thinking about your challenges that you see in taxing the digital economy, another one I'd probably point out is on technical services rules. You see, there's this problem. If you want to be able to tax income, you have to classify it either as a business profit, as a management fee, as professional services, or even as technical services. And many people have argued that technical services is where you're supposed to use that classification to tax the digital economy. But the digital economy is about software. It's not about technical services. And therefore, because we are not agreeable on this particular definition, the rules that allow us to tax technical services don't apply to the taxation of digital business models and services. Like, how do you assume like algorithms is a technical service? It's really difficult. How do we assume automated cloud service is a technical service? We don't have an agreement on that, therefore this becomes another obstacle. And then the other obstacle is on automation. Automation simply means you don't need human presence or human intervention. Right? So you have an AI agent, you have a robot. It doesn't need human intervention. It's a different sort of a personality. How do we tax that? So right now, if you open up a cafe in Sierra Leone and you don't employ human beings, but you employ robots, the robots are the ones cleaning, looking after the customers, taking the tea there, making the fufu, getting them to eat, taking payment from them. It's a robot. The robot doesn't need to pay for a house, for food, for drink. They don't have children to pay their education fees for, but it's providing services on your behalf. Can you say that you're paying a salary to the robot? Because that's the problem that's coming about in trying to understand automation. Should automation be subject to taxation? Because we don't have an agreement on this, we can't talk about taxing the digital economy, and that's another complicated challenge. Okay, so let's move on now to the next slide, please. So this is some of the answers to why is it so hard to tax the digital economy. I've talked about the permanent establishment, the technical services, and automation challenges. Then the rest are something that are easy for you to read and understand. Next, please. So now we also have to talk about the global frameworks that are out there. We know that the digital economy is with us. We know it is hard to tax it. But how is the world responding? So there are 4 tracks of reform that are now currently determining how to tax the digital economy. We have the OECD's Pillar 1 Amount A approach. This is the grand multilateral solution. It's about relocating profits of the largest multinationals to market countries. So firms above 20 billion euros in revenue that have a profitability above 10% would be subjected to taxation under OECD Pillar 1 Amount A. The problem here is that the United States withdrew in January 2025, and without the US, the ratification threshold is nearly impossible. So diplomats call it stalled. And I would use a basically very stronger word to say that the OECD Pillar 1 approach is dead. Then we also have the UN Model Article 12B, which currently gives us a pragmatic alternative. Source country withholding tax on automated digital services. That is what Article 12 allows us. It says you can tax the digital economy provided you're able to establish that there is there is a digitally delivered service that has come into your country and that your citizen has used it and paid for it, and then you can get that digital company to pay up to 3 or 4% of the gross income that it has earned from your own country, and it doesn't require a permanent establishment threshold. It's simple, it's operational, and 14 treaties have been updated on the basis of this. It's something similar to the digital service tax that Kenya imposed. And then the other ways in which we're beginning to create frameworks to tax the digital economy is doing so domestically by coming up with unilateral measures. And the example is thinking about the significant economic presence tax like in Nigeria and Kenya, and then previously looking at taxing digital services at 1.5% as we did in Kenya. And most importantly is the United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. This is the most important thing that has been happening since last year, and by next year we should be able to get a resolution on having a new treaty that's going to regulate for us our cross-border taxation. And part of this new treaty is where we're discussing how to tax digital services. So there's no answer to this at the moment, but we're trying to establish new rules, new nexus rules to be able to tax those digital business models that we looked at earlier, and also these emerging forms of digital business models like AI as a service, data brokerage, and cloud computing. So majority of the answers to how we're taxing these digital business models would be with us by September 2027. Next slide, please. So here I want to touch a little bit on Formula 1, Pillar 1 on Amount A. You just need to understand it because it is important in case this discussion picks up or it is brought back in to the tax convention discussions happening in New York and Nairobi, then you will understand what it really means. So Pillar 1 is about scope. It says if you're a multinational corporation and you're a digital company, and you have a global revenue that exceeds 20 billion euros, and you have a profit above 10%, then you are subjected to paying taxes in the countries where you are collecting your profits from. So it's about market jurisdictions. However, the extractive sector, the financial services, and defense is basically excluded. Now, the formula here is to simply calculate total profit above a 10% routine return on revenue. So take 25% of that excess and distribute it to countries based on their share of the total revenue of the firm. So if the firm has earned, say, 6 billion, you take 25% of 6 billion, that amount you then agree and say, that amount that is there, the 25% of 6 billion, should go to Kenya, Rwanda, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Ghana, based on how much this particular company generated from these countries. So there's a whole paper that I can share with you where South Center did some research to come up with the mathematics to see what developing countries would get out of applying this formula. So next slide, please. I think what makes sense is to be able to look at how this formula can be applied. Take the example of something called Tech Company Global. That's the name of the firm. Say it has earned 50 billion euros in revenue. Okay, so what comes out is 12.5 billion as the adjusted profit before tax, which is the 25% margin. Okay. And then the profitability threshold of this company should be about 10% of revenue. So say 5 billion, okay? So the excess here is 7.5 billion. Now, take 25% of the excess that is available for relocation globally. That's about 1.8 billion euros. That is what now the digital company has to ensure it pays to market jurisdictions. So let's give it the example of Ghana. Ghana earns 200 million euros from tech company, which is about 0.4% of global revenue. which means then Ghana's allocation is going to be 7.5 million euros of relocated profit. At 25% corporate income tax, it roughly gets about 1.9 million euros before the safe harbor potentially reduces it further. Now you try and compare a 3% digital service tax on the same 200 million, which is what you get, 6 million euros. Now, if we were to apply Article 12B at 4%, Ghana would get 8 million. So Pillar 1 delivers about a quarter of what a straightforward digital service tax yields. And the condition that Pillar 1 comes up with to tell us is that you are not allowed to come up with unilateral tax measures. But clearly, if we are to apply Pillar 1 under the OECD's Amount A approach to tax the digital economy, we don't get a lot of revenue than we would by applying our own local laws or by applying the UN model. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. And then next slide. So I've jumped over those slides because I've already talked to you about what Pillar 1 does, what the United Nations article does, and what the approach is under the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation when it actually comes to thinking about how do we tax the digital economy going forward. And now I want to talk to you about strategy and regional action. Questions about what really should WATAF do going forward if we need to now undo the challenges that we are seeing emerging in the digital economy so as to allow us to be able to tax some of these digital business models. So far we have been diagnosing the problem. And now to be able to give you the answer, I have 6 strategic pillars. And the first is that we need to think about legal reform. Maybe we need to think about enacting the digital service tax or even the significant economic presence legislation. We really need to define digital services broadly. How are you in your countries defining digitally delivered services? Are you only focusing on Amazon, Google, Netflix, or are you also looking at cloud computing firms? Are you looking at artificial intelligence? Are you looking at data brokerage firms as well? Because without including this, you're losing a tremendous stream of revenue that can be taxed for your countries. We also need to think about legal reform in the sense of creating something called a deemed permanent establishment for significant economic presence. How about you take an approach like I think the Saudi government took by creating something called a digital permanent establishment and a virtual permanent establishment, because then that gives you the nexus to tax. And to do this, you need to coordinate with your neighbors, right? Because if you have an inconsistent definition in Ghana and you have a definition which is very different in Sierra Leone, then what happens is that you will not be able to coordinate well on thinking about taxing the digital economy, because to tax the digital economy, we need to see country by country reports. And if you have differences in definition, you will not be able to capture the digital business model accurately. The second is infrastructure. We simply need simplified non-resident registration portals. And actually Liberia does that. Liberia, because it's a flag state for ships, it basically has a registration portal where all the ships that are subjected to the flag state have been reported there. So something like a model for us to apply and say, can we ask all digital service providers around the world, right, that are providing services to even one user in our country to register onto our portal, because that then would allow us to be able to build infrastructure that allows for real-time transaction monitoring integrated with payment gateways. And then we also need to see data analytics for risk profiling. So we really need to upgrade our IT departments. The third is to bring in country by country reporting. This is so fundamental. Because what you need to do as WATAF and West African countries is join into the Multilateral Convention on Mutual Administrative Assistance, right? The MCAA under the OECD Inclusive Framework for Exchange. because that will help you to actually analyze the data. It's going to help you build capacity to spot the classic red flags. Once you're part of the MCAA, you'll be able to see which companies have high revenue but are paying near zero profits. Those who are collecting royalty payments that are flowing to conduct jurisdictions. So think back to the hypothetical scenario that I had given you at the start about Stream Africa, right? The scenario. Country by country reporting data would show you that the company in the US has a 28% margin, while the Nigerian entity reports less than 1%. And that discrepancy would be your starting point for conducting a proper audit. And then, of course, there's I think I already mentioned this about information exchange. You need to be able to work with the US to say, you have data on Google. Can you share the data that Google has been filing with you in terms of its returns, so that you can see how much profit has Google earned from which jurisdiction? And then human capital. This is what we're doing today. We're training ourselves in understanding platform economics, digital forensic accounting, API-based audit tools, right? And on the basis of having an understanding about the digital economy, how to tax it, seeing the invisible streams around it, you can think about creating specialized digital economy units within your tax administration. And then you can even partner with universities so that the universities can help also build further technical capacity of tax administrators to understand these core issues, really, really strongly. And there already is at the Ubora Academy platform of ACBF a course on taxing the digital economy. It's 5 modules and it takes you through in depth, right? What I have not been able to cover in just the 2 hours I have with you. And finally, you need to really coordinate a WTF position for Protocol 1. Protocol 1 is that document that is being discussed, debated, and negotiated at in New York under the Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. That is coming up with a new tax treaty that is going to override the OECD and the UN models. And that new treaty is where we are significantly, as Africa, bringing forward our ideas about how we want tax to be fairly allocated across our jurisdictions. And Protocol 1 is about taxing the digital services. So we really need WTF to come together and have a position statement on this, because when you show up as a bloc and you advocate for mandatory provisions, low nexus thresholds, and gross-based revenue taxing rights, we will have a win in how we can tax the digital economy. Of course, the WTF is part of the African group, and therefore it's already making significant strides on the same. Next slide, please. I'm about to finish. Please give me 5 minutes. We also need to think about regional action, right? You have WTF, you have ECOWAS, and you have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. These need to be tied together, because fragmentation will become our biggest weakness. So coordination among us, ECOWAS region and the AFCFTA, is really important. So I think the best that can be done within ECOWAS and WTF is to come up with a harmonized digital service tax framework. You don't need to keep it identical, but you need to have a compatible legislation. So for example, you need to think about coming up with a common rate band of say 1 to 3% on how you're going to tax digital business models. You need to have unified definitions and coordinated timelines. So mutual administrative assistance within the WTF region is really important. Share audit intelligence, come up with joint risk frameworks. And ACBF together with the WTF administration, we can support you to build all this, right? And think about designing a single ECOWAS non-registration registration portal, right? Where you're going to it's going to help you see all high value, low value digital transactions taking place within the West African region, and to see which companies are compliant with providing country by country reporting. And then on the AFTCA side, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, we also need to have an e-commerce protocol, which is going to set for us the digital trade rules for Pan-Africa. So, we're with AFTCA coming into force, there will be a lot of free movement of people, labor, and capital, and customs duties are going to be removed. What does that mean for a digital business model that's now going to be operating within the continent? We need to come up with an e-commerce protocol to be able to tax those companies, lest they use the AU data policy framework or they use the Pan-African digital trade rules to now not pay any taxes on in our jurisdictions. So the next slide, please. In this slide, you're simply going to see different approaches by different countries on how they have come about to start taxing the digital economy. And I'll just talk about Kenya quickly because it's an interesting case. Kenya, we started with a 1.5% digital service tax in January 2021, and then we replaced it in December 2024 with a significant economic presence tax. So how this tax works is that you have a non-resident, like a digital company, and it has users in Kenya. And as long as that particular company is deemed to have 10% taxable profits on gross turnover, then we tax that company at a standard 30% corporate income tax rate, which is basically producing an effective rate of 3%. So generally, you could be Google and you have a Kenyan market. Then Google needs to provide country by country reporting to Kenya, and on the profits that it has made from Kenya, as long as it meets the threshold of 10%, that profit margin on their gross turnover, we're able to tax that at 30% going forward. And then the rest of the countries that you're seeing on the slide are their approaches to taxing the digital economy. And now finally, the next slide, please. When it comes to the digital economy, I refer to it as the unfinished agenda, because even our leaders are currently only scratching the surface of the digital economy. There's something called data monetization. There are firms that deal with data monetization. It's $1 trillion industry. It's not being taxed anywhere. Algorithmic advertising, cloud computing in most jurisdictions, cryptocurrency, AI as a service, in-game purchases, and creator economy payments like TikTok and Instagram, people who are earning money from that, all of that remains untaxed. And there's a central paradox here. African countries, we possess the sovereign right to tax, but without infrastructure, without the legal framework, without technical capacity and international cooperation, and even the political will, those rights, they remain theoretical. So I really think we would need to have a separate session on introducing you to what is the United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. What are its two protocols on taxing the digital economy and resolving dispute resolution, so that you really understand where this conversation is going and what new rules we're actually debating and negotiating on. So now, last slide, please. I want to close with the questions rather than conclusions. And there are questions I've listed for you on the slide, but let me just pick a few. If data is the most valuable resource of the 21st century, why does no international framework tax its extraction from African users? We levy royalties on copper and diamonds. Why don't we levy royalties on data? That's something that we really need to think about, and we need to come up with some sort of a position for the West African countries. And then Google earns more from advertising to Nigerian users than the federal allocation to many Nigerian states. So what does fiscal sovereignty actually mean in that context? Does fiscal sovereignty only mean that if you're a Nigerian living in Nigeria, the FIRS then is allowed to tax you? But if you have a company coming from New York and earning money from the Nigerians, why can't FIRS ask that foreign company to pay taxes in Nigeria as well? What really does sovereignty mean? And is that concept being challenged as we think about the digital economy? Right? So think about these. We're going to open up the forum for discussion on some of these questions that we have here, and also get back to any question that you have for me, and then the way forward. And now I will finish. And as I finish, I want to go back to the hypothetical scenario I started with. Remember, I talked to you about Stream Africa? $120 million in revenue is what this company made. and it declared 800,000 in declared profit, which is and out of that 85% royalty flowed to the US, and only a 3% commission was retained by the commission agent in Lagos. So now you're here with the transfer pricing file on your desk with no comparables, no precedent, and no framework designed for the business model in front of you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is actually the reality of the digital economy. We do not have rules to tax the digital economy, and the current rules that we are designing are being contested in New York, right, on the basis of how do we need to formulate the United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. We don't have regional coordination, but some countries are coming up with unilateral action, like digital service models. So this is it, ladies and gentlemen. I will stop here and open up the floor for discussions and engagements going forward. Thank you so much, and I hope this was productive and you have been informed. But now, ask me the questions that you have been waiting for. Thank you so much, Mohammed. Back to you.